So hello, everybody. It's really good to see you again, really excited to talk about the topic of today's panel, which is mixed reality in the Army, the soldier in mixed reality, human-centered and cognitively focused. So I'm excited to be talking with you all today and trying to unpack how Army researchers and their partners are addressing this important topic. We're all researchers actively engaged in research using mixed reality. And our research interests span the gamut from improving the efficacy of these kind of mixed reality technologies, as well as finding innovative ways to leverage them to deliver unprecedented capabilities to our soldiers. So I'll expect we're going to cover a lot of ground during this discussion, and I'm excited to begin. But before I do, I'd just like to note a quick disclaimer. Any views expressed in this discussion are solely those of the panelists and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or views of the Department of the Army, Department of Defense, or the United States government. With that said, let's meet our excellent panelists. First up, I'd like to introduce Dr. Michael Geist. Could you take a moment to introduce yourself and the problems you're working on?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Aaron. So my name is Michael Geist. I'm a project lead at Army Research Labs, Human Research and Engineering Directorate. My background is in cognitive psychology, so that's what I have my degree in. I specialize in visual perception and spatial cognition, so how people perceive and reason about the physical space around them. A lot of the work that I'm doing now focuses on how we can leverage what we know about cognitive processes and how they function in virtual realities and mixed realities, how they're influenced by those display technologies, and specifically how we can leverage those technologies to augment cognitive processes and cognitive functioning.
Great, thanks. Next up, we have Ms. Jessica Burlhart.
Thanks, Aaron. Hi, I'm Jessica Burlhart. I'm the director of the Mixed Reality Lab at the Institute for Creative Technologies, part of USC. We are a UARC, so we're a university-affiliated research center, and a lot of the work that we do is primarily for the Department of Defense, so looking at the Army, Navy, Air Force, and so on. And a lot of the work that my particular lab does focuses a lot on human-computer interaction, and a lot of that comes back to human-centered design. So we look at emerging technologies, how that evolves the conversation around the ways that we as humans interact with the world, with each other, with the technologies themselves, how those technologies enhance those abilities, how we can learn more from what those technologies teach us about who we are and how we interact with the world. And some of this research involves, looking at abstraction techniques for visual assets. So instead of doing photorealistic assets, are there other ways we can represent, the virtual world or the synthetic environment? So it's optimized, but it's also something that retains core information. We look at drone human interaction. We look at kind of all sorts of stuff, and I don't want to take too much of time, but I'm sure we'll talk about a lot about what we've been working on today. But yeah, it's great to be here. Yeah.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
Next, we have Dr. Lexi Nagel from Microsoft.
Hi, Aaron. Hi, everybody. It's good to see you again, and happy Monday. Yeah, really excited to talk more about, what we're using, a technique called soldier-centered design, derived from human-centered design, on some of our work with the IVAS program, which is a large scale effort design, really the best equipment for the soldier in a very tight timeline. And it's a really interesting partnership between, a vendor and really our customer, the Army. A little bit about me, my background is in human factors. So really kind of working in my niche as a researcher, as a user researcher, and based on my training, right? Human factors individuals do a lot of work around taking those cognitive principles and then putting them into technology and making sure that that technology works well with that person. Done a lot of work for the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy around this space as well, making sure that it's the right tool and the person can use it and interact with it, and it doesn't distract or detract from them doing the job and the things that they want to do.
Great, thank you. And I guess I should introduce myself as well. My name is Dr. Aaron Gardoni, and I'm a cognitive scientist at the U.S. Army Combat Capabilities Development Command Soldier Center, where I do a host of cognitive science research projects looking at augmented and virtual reality technologies. Specifically, we're looking at ways that we can develop human-centered augmented and virtual reality systems that are informed by the cognitive capacities and limitations of the human user. So now that we've all introduced ourselves to each other, even though we all know each other, let's get into the discussion. I'll start off by saying, in the past several years, is kind of the topic, big topic of the discussion today. We've seen the U.S. Army Futures Command, as well as the Department of Defense more broadly, invest significantly in mixed reality technology. Where do we stand with the Army today with mixed reality, and how are we innovating in this space and to deliver new capabilities to soldiers, and what do you think is driving this recent push? So there's lots to unpack there. I think the best way to do this is, we can call out answers. Feel free to raise hands. We'll see how it goes. So go ahead.
I'll go ahead and jump in on your last question there, which was, what do you think is driving this push to use augmented reality, mixed reality technologies? I think a lot of it comes from a desire to enable flexible and adaptive squads. So lower echelons who can react to new situations, update mission planning in the middle of a mission, and utilize situational awareness information that may be coming from outside sources, and use it directly in the moment. So a lot of that, I think, where we are as an Army right now focuses on how to represent that information using this new type of medium.
I'm happy to jump in and pile on as well. Right, I think so much of this is driven by the modernization priorities for the Army, right? That is a great set of information, right? Of like, here is where the Army is now, and here's where we want to be by 2035. And same thing with some of the other branches as well, right? This push toward, really making the most adaptable soldier with again, the right technology. So I think that we're in a really interesting time, right? Because now XR and mixed reality has kind of grown and shifted to really support the life of the warfighter, right? Out in the world when they're deployed or when they're training at home. So I think our technology has kind of caught up to what the warfighter can do. So it's a very interesting time for tech and for the soldier.
Yeah, I guess I'll add. From my perspective, and again, I'm not too much in the trenches here on modernization objectives for the Army, other than what I've been told within certain degrees of access. So I would say that for me, I think there are problems that still persist within the Army that have yet to be solved. A number of them are ones that you see a lot in the news. There are the suicide rate in the Army has gone up. And you still have, tension between genders, and you have, a lot of information coming at these soldiers. So it's not even just how do we extend their capabilities? It's almost like, as we introduce these new technologies, how do we not overload them? How do we think about not only culturally what's happening in the Army, but also thinking about what's happening culturally in the world, the expectations that are put on the soldier, but also all the potential problems that new emerging technologies bring to bear. So I think while also pushing the Army forward, there's also this need to reinforce the platform that the Army stands on, and then also keep ourselves in check in terms of how much we're actually delivering to a soldier, how much is too much, and then making sure that we make educated decisions based on that. So,
yeah, that point about how much is too much is definitely a question that we've all talked about as being important in this work, because it is innovative technology, it's new, but there's a learning curve, and it's a more significant learning curve than a lot of the other technologies that soldiers might already be interacting with, like smartphones and things like that. I think, for me, I think the big thing I see with the recent push is just the explosion of the commercial market of these technologies that, 10, 15, 20 years ago, was virtual reality research going on in the Army, and we should of course discuss how the Department of Defense and the Army has really innovated in that area in the past. But now we're in a situation where you can go on your favorite online retailer and have a virtual reality headset with capabilities that you could have barely dreamed of 20 years ago, drop ship to your house in a day or two, and have it set up that afternoon. And that's really, I think, an amazing way to democratize, this technology, both to the consumer, but also to the soldier, that you can actually bring those headsets, those systems out to, out to their location and deliver the content to them where it's needed.
I think just continuing a little bit off of what Jessica was saying, I think a lot of what you were saying, Jessica, was about not doing harm, right? So we want to provide additional capabilities that the augmented reality and mixed reality technologies potentially could provide, but we want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that we're ensuring that we're not interfering with the performance on other tasks. So when Aaron's talking about like potentially the consumer use of AR, that consumer is standing in their basement or in their room comfortably with their headset. The worst danger that they're going to come across is maybe bumping into a wall if they're using VR. But the reality of the situation for the soldier is much different. They have multiple tasks that they're balancing. And so I think a lot of the research and kind of gaps that we need to fill in are focused on how we can display information or how we can utilize these devices to provide new capabilities, but not simultaneously hurt all of the myriad of tasks that soldiers need to be performing.
Yeah, that's a great point, Michael. When we talk about the risks that mixed reality carries for the soldier user, they're a lot different than the risks of the consumer user. A bad VR headset might get you a 2-star review on the online retailer site, but it can have significantly graver harms for a soldier user. Lexi, I'm wondering how your work with the integrated visual augmentation system is addressing that. If you could maybe speak to that a little bit, how you're incorporating soldier feedback.
Yeah, sure. So what we're doing is we've taken, again, human-centered design, which has been around for a little while. IDEO really championed that and pioneered a lot of work and information there and really stood that up. And we've kind of taken it and tailored it to how industry innovates. So we've really taken human-centered design and turned it into soldier-centered design, right? That's our biggest customer right now with the IVAS program. And so one thing we've done is we've set up a whole bunch of different types of tests. One of those, and research studies, and one of those studies has been what we call embedded soldier studies. And before COVID, we had soldiers coming out to Microsoft in Redmond, and they would come out for a week and they would see all different parts of IVAS. They basically see the suite of products supporting IVAS, and they would give us feedback in real time with engineers, with researchers, with designers present, and you could learn and really empathize and begin to understand, like, okay, this is how that is not going to work for them, right? Like, we thought this design would work, or this engineering would work, and it just doesn't quite work, right, for whatever reason. And that's a great way to iteratively and quickly get feedback and then turn around and build it into the product in the next week or in the next sprint. A couple of other types of studies we've had and conducted as a part of the program have been user studies, and these are smaller with a squad, and then user juries, which is larger in size, and then actually more leaning toward like a formal evaluation. And then we have actual soldier touch points, and these have been conducted with upwards of a company. So really getting a ton, literally a ton of soldier feedback, in real time with real users doing real, like near real activities, like very combat related activities, to take everything they have to say, take that real feedback and get it into the product and the engineering of the product. And through all those tests, it's really accumulated in about 25,000 hours of soldier feedback. And that's with the researcher sitting with a soldier at these events and talking to them. So back to Jessica's point, I want to emphasize, right, too, because I think, right, it's like there's also kind of all these other things we have to think about going on. Not only does the headset work like it should, but the soldiers even bring things up too of, around harm and ethics and rules of engagement. And so that's all super important to take back into the product. And I think when our stakeholders hear that in like our video work, they're much more like active and engaged and want to make change there and like really do the right thing and build the product in the right way.
I wonder like if we can open that point up a little bit more to the other panelists about how you've seen soldier feedback in your and user feedback in your research play out, and how it's kind of affected you or changed the way that you've done your research moving forward.
Yes, I can start. So I come mostly from industry. So my knowledge of the military is, well, especially when I started, was fairly minimal. And I, again, pre-COVID, I was able to go to like conferences like ITSEC and be able to see a number of the ways that some of these technologies were being communicated. What I thought was really interesting on a broad scale was how these technologies were talked about, this idea of like serious games, serious VR, serious AR, and so on. And I always think that all of it's serious, so I don't really understand why anyone had to make another category for it. But I understand the need for the experiences that are more about function than they are about entertainment or art or creativity or any of that. I kind of come from a place where both can exist, and I think that's just really good design when both can exist. And I think generally feedback that I've gotten from soldiers has been like, this stuff's really boring. Not the stuff that we're doing, but generally before, it's like being forced to do another thing, and then have that thing be kind of boring and not really that interesting. I take that to heart. For me, it's like, okay, well, we can do better. This doesn't have to be a boring research thing for you. We can figure out a way to actually make this engaging for you, and bring you more into the process. To Lexi's point, having them at all these touch points, making it their project, not just a project they're outsourcing to you to figure it out. I think there's a lot of engagement there. But I also think there's, a lot of the human truths that exist, soldier-centered or human-centered. It's all human-centered. So I think a lot of the things and a lot of the problems, a lot of the problems that we see in industry as it relates to emerging technologies. All that stuff's still the same. The person in the basement with the headset and the soldier in the field, the environment's very different. The stakes are incredible, so much higher. I don't want to avoid talking about that, but but from a design perspective, you're kind of dealing with the same thing. And I think that to me has been encouraging, because I think not only are we helping to do research that makes the experience of the soldier better and makes them safer, and a number of other things that always we discussed, but it's also something that can then be pushed into industry, and it makes everyone's experience with these technologies even better. So I think there's a lot of learnings, especially with the work that the three of you are doing, that will also permeate the industry as well, because it's all part of the same human story, I think, when it comes to this stuff.
Yeah, I was shaking my head along as you were talking, Jessica, because I think that's an important point in terms of a question of like, when do we need soldiers as the test subjects, and why do we need them as the test subjects? And so let me first say that I think using soldiers is a great way to get qualitative and quantitative feedback. I think it's important to understand when the research question or when the development process requires soldiers and when it doesn't. For a lot of the processes that we're studying, if it's like visual space perception, humans are pretty consistent across individuals and across expertise in terms of judging the space around them and perceiving that space and the distance of virtual content, for example. There are exceptions to that rule. So architects and engineers understand that people misperceive slants, for example. So they'll overestimate a hill and they'll cognitively correct for that error in perception. Soldiers, I think, are trained as well, specifically in terms of estimating distance to targets. And that expertise can definitely influence the results that we're looking at in some of the studies that we're investigating.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, one thing that I would add from my personal experience running studies with mixed reality technology is, in many cases, you're handing the technology, whether it is a soldier user or civilian user, in many cases, you're handing them a piece of technology that they've never handled before, that they've never put on their head before, that is very cool and is very fun and different and interesting. And many times that initial reaction is a little hard to get past. Like you say, like, hey, could you use this for mission planning? Do you think this would be helpful during navigation? And the feedback you get is, yeah, definitely, this is awesome. But when you look at, and those are some of the qualitative, responses, and those are great, and that's great to have that level of engagement, certainly. But I always collect quantitative data as well, quantitative performance data. We set up scenarios that they have to do in VR or AR and look at how, in addition to the user experience factors and things, how they're actually doing on soldier relevant tasks. And what we often find is that in some cases, what the user determined or responded as being quite positive about didn't necessarily positively affect their performance on the task any better than a control map would, for example. So I think if I can summarize that long-winded comment into one sentence, it would be that qualitative data should always be supported and by quantitative data, performance data as well.
I was about to say, like, I think the conversation around, like, it seems like the relationship probably is currently still like, how can we leverage these technologies, right? How can we do what we do, but in these technologies? And I feel like that needs to be flipped, because it's really just, what are our main problems and how can these technologies help us solve them? So I think, on one hand, yes, pushing, like looking ahead at like, how can we be better soldiers? How can we think about, soldier health, soldier performance, health being mental, physical, all of that. How do we solve? But it's more like, how do these individual technologies actually, within their superpowers, give us a chance to solve these problems? And Aaron, to your point, sometimes a map does super well. Sometimes a sand drawing is all you need. And it does require, I think efficacy is more about is almost less about the performance of someone in a virtual world relative to another performance in a virtual world, but also thinking about, like, in reality, are these other things better than this? What, does this technology, I mean, the fact, to your point, like, there's a huge onboarding process, and that differs in age too. You have soldiers coming in who are so much more used to computers and video games than their commanders, who are usually a little bit more confused by, like, why am I having to do this when it's been working fine this other way? And I do think that's also part of that larger conversation around, like, okay, but what are the problems really, and how do we use these technologies to help us solve them?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, we've done it so far today. We talk about soldiers, but there are so many types of soldiers, and there's so many military occupational specialties and levels of training. And, what the special forces operator might want out of their AR headset could be very different from the soldier from the 82nd Airborne. And so, getting that kind of feedback is super critical, but also understanding what's the problem set that 82nd soldier has versus the problem set that special forces operator has.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, and maybe speaks to some of the innovation that we should be doing with AR displays, and in terms of individualizing the communication or contextualizing the information to meet those specific needs. So I think there's a lot of work that could be done to inform how we transition modes, if you will, of operation and AR between different contexts.
Well, I know you're being a little bashful, Mike, because you do that work.
I do that work, yeah. But you set it up for me, so I had to spike it down there.
Well, it's interesting because like workspaces, right? If you look at like anything, even something like Photoshop, right? Like not everyone, yes, Photoshop exists, but you're not always going to use Photoshop just to edit photos. You might be creating interfaces for websites or devices, or you might be going to print or to mobile. Like I think to your point, Michael, and I think this is really big, and I think all of us are working on this. Is my understanding, but like understanding context is really key here. Like it's not a one size fits all ecosystem, or sorry, it's not a one size fits all solution. It is an ecosystem of these possible work touch points, and building interfaces that are flexible, being able to handle real-time data, and having that almost be the way that we gain contacts. Like figuring out how do you understand the world more and the granularity of the situation, so that the information you're delivering is actually being delivered in the right way to the right touch point. I think getting that right is a big part of the success of this stuff.
Yeah, so I'd like to return to a point you made a little earlier, Jessica, about problems versus technology, and the idea that we might have it a little backward, talking about tech first when we really should be talking about the problems first. And I would just open it up to the group and ask, what do you see as some of the problems that soldiers face that could be most readily addressed by mixed reality technology compared to the other technologies or techniques that are out there currently?
I guess I'll start situational awareness, gaining experience in something that they would have to be in a particular situation and perhaps in harm's way in order to gain that sort of experience. So figuring out how to put them in a stressful position and have them kind of work through it multiple times without necessarily without the not at the expense of their lives or other people's lives, let's say. And learning how to put certain things together, where certain controls are. I guess that's another kind of brass tacks use case. I think again, it's like an emotional thing also too. I know that might not be a word that we use very much, but I think that the emotional resonance there, like being able to feel comfortable in a space, be able to ask questions they wouldn't normally feel comfortable asking in the real world, being able to I guess flex a bit, both emotionally and physically in that sense. I think VR for sure gives soldiers a chance to do that. And I guess from an AR perspective, it feels to me like that's, I know Lexi can definitely talk to this a lot more than I can, but extending the capabilities of someone. So there's a limit to how far we can hear, but can we have an autonomous machine be able to actually do the hearing for them at a certain range, then deliver that information back to the soldier. So again, it's also thinking about, how do we create an ecosystem that extends, and creates a superpower type bubble around the people who are using these technologies. That was a lot, but I thought I'd start and just say a bunch of stuff.
It was great. Yeah, it was great, Jessica. I'd love to jump into, so one thing that we do through our version of soldier-centered design, we do a lot of work around distilling needs and like what do users need at the end of the day. And a lot of that, right, has been around situational awareness. And I loved your point about like, right, well, do we extend their hearing? Is that like a need that they have? Like, I need to be able to hear these things in this type of environment? Or do you need to communicate in a certain way, right? Because that's also really important too, of how do we improve silent communication, right? You need to tell someone something very important is happening or unfolding in front of you, and you have to, right, in the field, very silently tell someone and indicate to someone that this is happening. So we really use those needs to help define our engineering efforts and, right, like flip the question, right? That's how we've kind of been tackling that, is let's work from the needs and then like engineer around the need or the problem set, right?
Jessica bringing up the point of being able to hear much farther away. I think also, obviously, with augmented reality, you can see what's farther away. So you can represent the location of potential enemies, and you can see them potentially through the wall using AR. So there's a little bit of a capability there in terms of X-ray vision. Obviously not actual X-ray vision, but using virtual content to represent stuff beyond a physical wall. I think that's an area where I think AR could provide some unique capabilities. I think there's risks in using, or let me back up a second. There's also, I think, some utility added by augmented reality for the immediate guidance of action. So when you can represent stuff in the physical space, you can prime people to act on it as if it's a real object. And so there's, for example, ATR, so automated target recognition. You can use an AI system to identify potential threats in the environment, and you can display that information in a way that would prompt soldiers to not only attend to it, identify that the threat is there, but also to engage that threat in a much quicker way.
You know, I think one thing that we haven't touched on as much today, but is certainly a really relevant area for these technologies, is on the training side. So, you know, being able to expose soldiers to situations, real world situations to train on repeatedly, get their sets and reps in, but also to set them up with, you know, scenarios where maybe low probability events happen that you know, generally they're not going, they might go their whole military career and not see in the field, that we can train them up on how to do that using a virtual reality interface. And some of my excellent colleagues at the Simulation Training and Technology Center down in Orlando are doing this with the synthetic training environment effort within the Army, fighting 25 bloodless fights before the fight and things like that. So that's a really exciting thing. I think critical to the success of that, though, is definitely understanding the fidelity, the requirements, as you mentioned, Jessica, of these training scenarios, both in the terms of visual fidelity, but functional fidelity. If you have a VR rifle, is it going to operate in the same way as the real issued rifle, or not? And does that matter for this particular training context? I mean, these are some of the questions that I and others, all other colleagues of mine, think about.
Yeah, I mean, there's also this question and something that kind of bothers a lot of creators, and especially in the mixed reality field, which is, this is a medium that can allow you to do all sorts of really unique and wonderful things. We're just figuring this out right now. We're still trying to, scratching the surface, so to speak. But there is some sort of, there is this kind of weird but understandable ethos of like, okay, we need to recreate reality in VR exactly the way that reality is, to such a detail that if you get really close to a blade of grass, you can see like all the little tiny whatever. So it's like, okay, but that's not really the point of all of this. I mean, it can be from like a, again, visual awareness, situational awareness, as Lexi pointed out. I think that's vital and it's really important. And sometimes it is important to know where the button is, because if you go there and the button's not there, it's a problem, So, but I think that as it relates to what VR, AR, any of these emerging technologies and the mediums themselves, the content themselves can do, I think there's a lot of opportunity there that the Army, and this is, again, my opinion, isn't taking advantage of. And I think that's where it starts to get really interesting. Aaron, you're talking, you talk about fidelity, how much detail do you actually need is one question. The question of, do we really need to do like 200 reps of the same virtual environment simulation task? Or can we, have some sort of real-time data that makes you do it a number of times, and every time you do it, it makes it slightly different depending on what you choose to do or not do? Getting to representation of assets, like how can the representation of a soldier or be different and can be more fluid? Can the environment be more fluid? Does it always have to be so rigid? It's that notion that maybe even training can be better if things aren't so rigid. If things are constantly in flux and constantly changing, you have to be adaptive. Because I think that, Larry, that ability to be extremely adaptive, to everyone's point, and I know Lexi brought it up big time in the beginning, is that we need the soldier to be adaptive in order to become an even better soldier than he or she is now. And there's a lot of questions there, I think, around content and how we actually perceive what it means to actually make a VR AR training experience, like getting kind of more to the truth of what the objective is, as opposed to like just trying to shove reality through a square hole, so to speak.
Yeah, I agree with Jessica, what you're saying in terms of like the contextual fidelity and training and needs to be adaptive in and of itself. I think there's another level of fidelity in terms of perceptual fidelity. Obviously, we can go a little overboard with this, down to the grass, a blade of grass, and looking at it. But there at least should be a base level of perceptual fidelity that we need to achieve in terms of like the spatial location of objects. If people are misperceiving where virtual content is by as much as 30%, which some early research shows, then we'll have some problems down the road if they're training for a target that should be at 200 meters, but is in fact at 150 meters, or is being perceived at 150 meters rather. So we need to ensure that the base level of perception is accurate. Aaron, you brought up a good point in terms of the fidelity of the scenario and the tests. I think there's certain circumstances where, for example, if you're simulating a rifle and you're utilizing that rifle, if it's a simulated rifle, it doesn't have the recoil that a normal rifle does. And so you're not getting the muzzle flip as you fire it over and over again. And so you need to be at least aware of that, or other influences of the fidelity of the scenario and how they might influence your results that you're obtaining.
I'd love to chime in on this one as well, because so important. And I think that this is one huge use case for mixed reality, for extended reality, for augmented reality, right, is training. Because you can't quite train those real life scenarios. And I think one question our team has also been asking, internally has been, well, how, again, this question of how realistic does it need to be? How close do we want to push it? How close does the soldier need it to be, right? Even auditorily, right? You have a lot of confusion and kind of chaotic sounds in combat, right? You don't always know quite where something is coming from, but you do know if bullets are coming at you and the speed at which they're coming at you, that changes how you maneuver. And that's been one thing that's been really important to integrate into IVAS, has been that level of realism. Another thing that's been really interesting that we've been working on too has been, adversaries and how do they maneuver? How do they maneuver if I move a certain way, right? So how do they react to me? So like this adaptive AI, right, adds a whole new layer of complexity to the training simulation, but also again to the problem set and to the soldier, to the technology. Of all these things kind of have to coalesce and come together, and ensure that, right, the soldier still gets trained in the right ways. And that, right, it's sort of like Jessica was saying earlier, it's like a whole kind of new set. We know this is important, but there's a new set of things we got to go figure out now.
Yeah, I think that's what's so exciting too, is like you imagine like I always try to put it in a story. That's sort of ICT's sort of MO. Like we work a lot with Hollywood, gaming companies, and so on. So it's, again, the creativity aspect is a big part of the ethos of our team and our institute. And one of the things I like to do is put myself in the head of the soldier, talk about soldier-centered design, just like, okay, well then I'm the soldier, and thinking about how these technologies, if I was just going for like a walk, just like somewhere I don't know, like trying to really get it to like baseline, thinking about, to Lexi's point, I hear a sound in the distance that's accentuated by maybe my kind of dog-like drone thing that's following me around, and I'm able to hear where it's coming from. And not only do I know that there's a sound coming there, I know what kind of weapon it is. I know what kind of bullets it's going to be able to shoot at me. I know, I'm able to actually, to your point, Lexi, almost like move in a particular way as a response to the fact that there is a bullet coming my way. Like this idea that you can actually just have almost on your tool belt these different capabilities that then become, that's the reality part of this, right? It's not so much like, can I see the bullet? Can I see the blade of grass example, I guess we've overused at this point, but can I extend, can I achieve something that protects my life? Because that's very real. And I think that's the thing that it comes down to, isn't so much like the human part of this is the emotional response and the capability of keeping you safe and others safe. Like that is the main objective, I would think, for any soldier, really. And so, forget the environment being X, Y, and Z, except to what Michael said, like sometimes you do need to an extent for things to be where they need to be. But aside from that, just thinking of, what's the most important part here? And then how do you focus the attention and the detail towards that, as opposed to focusing your attention on how the worlds are built or how it sounds or whatever. All of that serves something greater.
I think one of the running themes in your example right there is just how dynamic and complex the environments are that they're going to be operating in. And when it's not as simple as taking a single snapshot of an experiment or a single training day and then we're going to be good. We need to understand how those dynamics influence not only your ability to notice that there was your dog identified an enemy over here, but you need to be aware of where the next potential threat's coming from. So you need to be able to simultaneously plan your maneuvers or whatever towards the identified threat, and also be scanning for new threats that come up, and directing attention appropriately using AR devices.
Like that, we are nearing the end of our time. I knew we knew it was going to happen, but I could talk with you guys for probably another hour about this, and want to, but we got to go. But I think if I could have maybe one more question that we could talk about before we break is, bringing it back to kind of the broader community. I mean, South by Southwest is a very diverse community of all kinds of professionals and creatives, and we've been talking a lot about mixed reality systems for the soldier, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are. With all the work that we do with the soldier in mind, how do you see some of the developments that we help create inform and benefit the audience member at South by Southwest?
The drones get you free barbecue. No, that. Probably a good answer. I'm not going to go first though, because
I mean, I'll just chime in because I kind of had an idea of my response for it, but I would say that historically that's what the Army and the DoD has done in this space, is that they've been a force for pushing mixed reality forward, going back to the 80s, and the benefits that we see, I mean, with ICT and their work, leading to things like the Oculus, stuff like that. It may seem like we work in a narrow area, but we really don't.
I guess I can start, since you mentioned ICT. I guess I have to transition gracefully. So the Mixed Reality Lab, my predecessor, Mark Bolas, who was the director at its beginnings, was responsible for a number of research projects around creating low-cost head-mounted displays. And a lot of that research was actually funded by ONR, so the Office of Naval Research. And so that eventually led to the Oculus Rift, Google Cardboard, and it really helped to start the conversation around, okay, now these really bulky, to Michael's earlier point, like bulky headsets, things that were way too expensive and large to ever be considered a household item, is now a household item. You can just order it on Amazon and get it within days. So that whole, a lot of the research, even though it seems like, to your point, Erin, we develop it in silos, it does eventually lead to some pretty amazing results in industry. And I think from the way that I see like us moving ahead, again, I come from industry, going to research and then seeing what's happening within the Army and other parts of the DoD. And I do think about it with the industry in mind, like what are problems across the board that need to be solved, but also, we think more now about content creation and the language of this stuff, how to make the best, kind of training environment for X, Y, or Z. How do we push that forward? How do we think of the next generation interface? Which is why it's always great to know more people that are working on the similar thing. I'm motioning at Lexi, but I don't know where I'm motioning in relation to you, Erin, so I'm just going to go do this. But I think all of that stuff is, it's always going to permeate. If it's effective and it's useful for a soldier, it will more than likely be as effective and useful for, an average user. So I would say as a South by goer, I wouldn't say read research papers because I have a hard time doing that too, but I would say, keep your ear out for stuff. Like think about, how you can be a part of something like this, even if in its infancy, and just really see like the results of research kind of sifting into this. That's a really bad, that last part was a bad answer, but anyway, I'll shut up. But I think it's by nature, this stuff gets out there and it's really hard to stop it when it's a good idea.
Great.
Just to add really quickly too, I think, right, yeah, it's not always apparent, right, but I think this is a great maybe like conversation around ideation and creativity, right, of here's what it is now. And I think it's a good thing you can start asking yourself questions around as a creator, as a, someone who likes to just pontificate about XR, mixed reality, of like, where does this go as like an art tool, right? Like, it's sort of like, I think this is a great conversation for creating the future, right? Like ask yourself these questions of like, okay, well, what is this? What is mixed reality in 10 years? And yeah, it's really cool that like you're doing these things for the soldier, but where do we expect that tech to go in a few years? And can you create it? I think that's always something that I have associated with South by Southwest is, really ideas kind of start here and kind of take off. And so I think, I guess, Erin, if I can leave with like a closing thought too, I really do hope that like the future of mixed reality, it grows quite a bit, right? Like I hope our sensor technology grows because that extends our reality, it extends our visual field. And then also the ruggedization of the technology as well, right? I really would love to really literally put glasses on, right, and just walk outside, and if I drop them, I don't have to worry about scratching my headset or scratching my AR glasses, right? Like I think it's a small step and maybe something not super totally important, but right, I would like to see that happen because I think that opens up new doors. If I can literally put on my glasses and walk outside and just sort of see whatever I want to see in the real world, the physical world, and the virtual world. It really creates a new set of possibilities for the soldier, for artists, for designers, for creators.
Just I'll end quickly here because I think we're nearing on our time. I'm very excited for the possibility of the future. I think augmented reality, mixed reality, display devices, the hardware themselves have matured to a point where we can start seeing broad creation of applications that could go onto those devices. And we're going to see it, I think, in a lot of different fields and we're already starting to see it in a lot of different fields, from manufacturing to repairing engines to navigating. There's a lot of different uses for having information directly in your face without having to turn to a screen and Google an answer. Having that information directly available, there's utility there. So I'm excited to see how that comes along. I think a lot of the problems that we're tackling with soldiers in an Army operational context, I think they're the hard cases. So we're shooting for the stars first, and then we'll propagate down into maybe the easier cases. But I think a lot of those findings will translate.
I agree with all of you. I think if I could add something, it would be that as you said, Mike, the use cases we're dealing with are really challenging. And so the cognitive factors, the human factors matter so much. And I think our careful consideration of those human factors, of that human and soldier-centered design, is something that I think will benefit, the mixed reality creators and makers out in the commercial sphere, because they should be thinking about it too. If they want their products to succeed, they should be thinking about this too, just like we're thinking about it in terms of soldier safety and effectiveness. So with that, I think I'll wrap this panel up. I want to thank everybody very much for participating in this excellent discussion. Michael Geis, Dr. Lexi Nagel, Jessica Burlhart, and I'm Aaron Gardoni. And thank you, I guess, Internet, for watching this. And and feel free to reach out if you have any questions about what we do. So thank you.